Okay, happy Wednesday, everyone. We are here in week 3. It's hard to believe it's already week 3 of the course. It seems like the first week felt very long, and now it's flying by, at least in my perception. As far as the course goes, let's see, I have been working today on your week 3 exploration, so I've got about 2/3 of the way through and hope to finish those up tonight. So if you haven't seen your feedback yet, you will by the end of the evening. And tomorrow I'm hoping to get on top of the week 2 projects, the visual mission statement projects. So hopefully have some feedback to you there in a timely manner, so that as you go into the third component of the mood board, and really aiming at getting on top of the Photoshop practices as well. Hopefully, by the weekend. And I think that's the only announcements that I have at this time. But start looking ahead since we're in week 3, we still have some time left. But week 4 is a little different, and you're probably familiar with that by now. But we are going to bring all of these different pieces together in the week 4 project. So you'll be using your Photoshop skills to bring the design you've been planning in the mood board to life through, by creating an actual working design. So you might want to glance ahead at that assignment and start thinking of how you want to bring all those elements together and what that will look like. Were there any questions before we get into this week's material? That anything I can answer, really quickly here? If anything more involved, I can meet with you after the presentation. Okay, good. All right, so we have been looking at different factors that go into visual design and different visual media designs. We looked at color, we've looked at imagery and visual storytelling. This week we're going to look at a couple of different topics, starting off with the use of typefaces, which is use of text and fonts. The word font is used interchangeably often with typeface. They actually do mean different things. Typeface is the actual lettering style of the lettering, whereas font traditionally refers to the characteristics of that typeface, like the weight of the font, or the weight of the typeface, the color of the typeface, and so on. But in modern language, it really is used pretty much to be synonymous, and I will understand what you mean if you do use the words in that way. And then we're also going to look at visual hierarchy, which is a factor of composition. So it really has to do with creating a planned experience for your viewers and putting the emphasis exactly where you want it to be. So let's start off looking at the use of typefaces and why fonts matter. This is an example I came across online recently, and really is pretty humorous, but it really drives home what this is all about. How you can create a completely different message based on the typeface that you choose. If you take a look, this is a handwritten note. One says, "You'll always be mine," written in a very flowing, pretty script typeface with a heart. And the other one says, "You'll always be mine," in a rather ominous, scary, roughly drawn typeface that looks like something from a horror film. So very different connotations depending on the typeface used, but exactly the same message in both cases. Fonts have changed and evolved over history, and just like there's different art styles in different periods of time, there's different styles of typefaces throughout different periods of history. And each of those carries an impression with it that we still hold today, depending on how that's commonly perceived in society. Not unlike how color psychology works, where it's kind of culturally dependent what's emphasized within our culture to for that to mean. For example, the carnival typeface down here on the lower left is pretty iconic. It's that's always associated with the circus and the carnival. You'll see that with the clowns and the elephants and the big top tent, almost always with the red and white striped tent as well. These really traditional serif typefaces, like you see on the bank, looks very businesslike and carries that more serious impression. And the Art Nouveau style down here in the lower center is very elegant. And even though it originates from that Victorian time when Art Nouveau was in style, now it carries that more elegant impression. You'll often see that on fancy menus at restaurants and so forth. And there's the 1960s counterculture, flower power style, and so forth. So when you see these, they, at least in in U.S. culture, they carry that impression with them, and the really ultra modern technology font here. So, and this is where a good knowledge of art history comes in handy. This is one of the reasons why art history is part of our curriculum, is to at least give you an introduction to some of the different styles and their significance, so you can leverage that in your own work. It's something I found to be very helpful in creating a given impression, is knowing what the styles were throughout different periods, and especially if you want to tie back to that, like the 1960s aesthetic, or even the 80s with some of the retro Atari looking typefaces and that kind of thing. Let me see. And typefaces are also an element of branding. We talked about brand colors last week, and and you think of a logo as being a big part of brand. Typefaces are pretty iconic as well, and here are a couple to look at. Let me go back. When you look at this image, what probably comes to mind is Coca-Cola, even though the word actually says Google. And it just kind of illustrates that it's not the wording itself that matters, it's that typeface, it's the visual impression that is ingrained in us. And you see plenty of well-known brands make use of this. Some of them are pretty traditional, like Disney and Coca-Cola. Some are more recent and emerging. Harry Potter has that very distinctive style. And a lot of the popular franchises will have recognizable typefaces that really is at the heart of their brand. And as with every brand element, the key is consistency. You select those elements and you keep using them until it becomes highly recognizable. It's just like how you recognize someone's face. Those characteristics are persistent. So whether it's Burger King's signage or packaging or their website, that typeface is going to stay the same, as well as the colors and the overall visual style. This is really relevant to what you're doing with your mood board this week, and it's going to be involve you selecting your own typefaces for this project that could become your own personal brand typefaces as well. And we'll look at some factors that go into how to choose those typefaces. Any thoughts or questions so far? That was a pretty quick introduction. Okay. So some examples I pulled from from your exploration activity. This one really stood out in terms of its use of typefaces for their symbolic connection. And the title of the book is Bases Loaded. You have imagery of a baseball bat handle and a syringe, a hypodermic needle, which is a visual metaphor for, I'm just looking at that, I would say it's probably steroid use, performance enhancing drugs in sports, particularly in baseball. The word loaded is emphasized, and that'll be something I'll touch on in visual hierarchy, but that word loaded is often refers to someone being intoxicated or under the influence of some kind of substance, whether it's alcohol or drugs. But look at these typeface styles. Those may be very familiar, especially if you are a fan of baseball, the sport of baseball. That script style typeface used for the word bases is something you often see on baseball signs and pennants. And that very boxy typeface that loaded is written in looks like what they use on baseball jerseys for the numbers and the player names and so forth. And there's our special guest again. So it really builds that connection to the sport, the subject matter itself, by using these typefaces that are iconic to that given sport, as well as symbolic use of the meaning of the words, with loaded having double meaning. Sometimes your subject matter will lend itself to this. It'll be an obvious choice. Baseball has very iconic typefaces associated with it. Sometimes it's more of a matter of the style that just suits your own, the personality or nature of your subject. Here's another one that's going for a very specific look, and that's more of a newspaper look. So they chose some typefaces that are very true to traditional newspaper print headlines and body text. And you can make use of the layout of your text to create a sense of action or movement. The Thrilling Tales has that tapering layout design that gives a sense of movement. Also, they're using those complementary colors, that bright red and yellow against the blue background, to make that extra pop of energy. Goes right along with the man's red jacket. The Superman title trailing after the little tiny Superman flying in the sky. So you sense that that's his path of flying up over the building. And the style of the typeface itself on the Superman title is very cartoonish, so it sets that feeling of kind of fun, quirky comic book look. And creating a sense of movement doesn't require anything so dramatic as that Superman title. Just simply that a slight angle is enough to give a upward movement in your text that in this case goes right along with the slope of the mountain. So you feel that upward kind of ascent of the climbers along with the arrangement of the text. So, as you know, a lot of this has a very depends on your own creativity and your own awareness of your subject matter, and picking a typeface that is of a style that is suitable to the given need. We're looking at this week. We're looking at picking and pairing different typefaces so that they work well together. The exploration reading had some guidelines in that regard, and it talks about body text versus heading text, which is very relevant to creating documents or website content if you have large amounts of text. This is just an excerpt from our course catalog, with the heading text being those bold headings that stand out and call attention to given pieces of information, and the body text is the large passages of content. And notice in this case that the headings are very different in style as well as weight from the body text. And that's in order to differentiate the two. When you are working with a document like a website, you really want your reader to be able to easily find the information they're looking for and know where different sections end or begin. So having this heading stand out, make it easy for them to skim your content, find what they want or what they need. Especially important in web design because you don't want to make it difficult for your website viewers to find a given piece of content. And so differentiating those pieces of text becomes very important. We've been really focusing on visual designs, things like advertisements and posters, which are very different from documents. There's usually less text copy. But the similar ideas apply. You want to differentiate your title versus the details so that you can use differing typefaces in that regard as well. We can call it heading text versus body text. You can call it primary and secondary typefaces. But it refers to the same concept. And this is true of this example we saw earlier as well. You have two different typefaces, very different styles, which is going to become a very important point. But notice that the more plain and readable style text is used in the small copy, the body text. And that's the most important factor for body text, is that it's readable. You don't want to use really decorative typefaces that are very fancy and may be attractive in small quantities, but when you get large pieces of text, they become difficult to read. Even as simple as a script style typeface. So stick to your traditional sans serif and serif typefaces, things like Arial, Times New Roman, Helvetica, and Helvetica New. These types of typefaces are great for body text. You can still instill a bit of personality depending on which one you choose. You notice the difference between Futura and Helvetica and something like New Gothic. All those are sans serif, but very different looks and very different styles. So it'll be a subtle difference, but can set the style. Even the difference between sans serif and serif. Serif fonts like Times New Roman, probably the best known, are generally thought of as being more traditional and old-fashioned, maybe more business-like, depending on which one you choose. But all of them remain very highly readable. Heading texts have a little bit more flexibility. You can instill a little bit more personality in your headings. You might use this typeface for your titles and banners as well, maybe a logo design. The key is that you differentiate your headings from your body text. The basic rule that's in the article I assigned is, if you're using a serif body text, then use a sans serif for your headings, and vice versa. So they're just different in style, and that's the very basic rule. What it really comes down to is just have a good contrast. These are just some examples. These are the names of the fonts paired together. But what you see in common is that they're all very highly different in style. There isn't like a single rule of thumb that I could say which typefaces will work together. Sometimes it is a matter of trial and error. So I would say, if you're picking out some typefaces, open up a Word document and give them a shot. See how they look together before you get into Photoshop and put time into the design. Make sure that they're attractive when paired together, because what you'll find is if you have typefaces that are similar in style, say two traditional serif typefaces, and try to put those together, it really doesn't work. It almost looks like you've made an error. You've accidentally left one in a different font. Whereas sometimes the most highly differing styles can have the most interesting looks when paired together. Things like, let's see, Thirsty Rough and Museo Sans. This looks very casual, almost like something you might see at a sports bar sign, paired with something that looks very formal. It's very highly contrasting impressions. Similar idea with Lobster and Baskerville. And those are the names of the fonts used. And this one right here, Fashion Victim with Champagne and Limousines, is kind of a counterexample to those two. Both of these are very sophisticated looking and very elegant. Their main contrast is in the weight of the designs. One's very heavy, one's very thin and delicate. And just scanning over this to see if there's any that really stand out as really unique pairings. Actually, Railway and Railway, which they're both the same typeface. You'll see this with especially typefaces like Helvetica New are specifically designed with different versions. There's Helvetica New Black, Helvetica New Extra Bold, regular, light, just for this purpose. And that's a case where you can use the same typeface family for both your headings and your body text. That's like this example down here. So while you have more flexibility here, you still want to keep it readable. If it gets too stylized, like the example in the lower right, you might be shooting yourself in the foot, because if your viewers can't read the headings or the titles, they're not going to get the information that they need, or or really receive your message. So this is really relevant to the project coming up. What I'll be looking for in the mood board is that you keep those ideas in mind when you choose your body text. I'm looking for something that's very readable, that's probably fairly common, so that if you are sharing a document, it's going to display the same on your reader's computer as it is on the one on your own when you created it. And then I'll be looking for a contrasting heading typeface to be selected. Something that maybe has some personality that matches the impression that you've already described in your earlier parts of your mood board, but that works well with the body text, that has some contrast, but still a significant style. Any thoughts or questions or anything that's unclear so far? Great. So there's some common pitfalls that I've observed just over the years, especially things that I see often in the Photoshop practice activities that I'll try to comment on, and in some of the projects, but just some simple things to look out for. Don't choose function over form over function. That is, this is just a caution that I made about body text. This is a good illustration. You want to create a style that's apparent, like the example on the left, using that really unique typeface for the headings, the names of the menu items in this case, but keeping the descriptions, the important details, readable. If you go for too much form, meaning too much emphasis on the style, then you're losing the value of your information. You can't really read that anymore. Not easily, anyway. Just like you don't want to use too many colors in a single design, you don't want to use too many typefaces. We limit it to 2 for this project. Unless you have a specific artistic style that calls for different typefaces, I wouldn't go any more than 2. It just can become confusing and can look messy. I know there's kind of there's been a recent trend I've noticed, especially in memes and things on social media, where you'll see different multiple typefaces used to create it. Almost looks like some kind of poster design, which is okay. I mean, that's a specific style that they're going for, but for the most part, and traditionally in graphic design, you avoid that. Always build in good contrast. This is something that I'll probably comment on frequently in the Photoshop practice. Pay attention to your background. Make sure that your text is highly readable. Usually they recommend having dark text on a light background, black text on a white background. There's some research that shows that instead of using solid black text on a white background, to use a darker gray for the fonts, and that's shown to sometimes be easier for people who have visual impairments or dyslexia to read. Which, something to consider. And always keep accessibility in mind. Light text on a dark background is the second best in general. It's really, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just considered to be a little bit more of an eye strain. But just avoid something like this on the upper right, where there's very little contrast. Depending on your monitor settings, that might become unreadable if it's not bright enough. And the other side of that coin, too crazy vibrant contrasts can become very jarring as well. So really highly saturated neon colors paired together, even if they're complementary colors, or maybe especially if they're complementary colors, it can just become painful. It's almost kind of an electric shock to your eyes looking at this. But the problem I see most often is when you have a complex image in the background and you put text over it, because it's so much variance in the lightness and darkness and color, you might have spots where the text just disappears, and so you'll want to take that into consideration. You can take some steps like lightening up the background around the text, like placing a text box under it. You can make use of drop shadows sometimes. Use those really sparingly. They can look kind of cliche if they're overused, and they can actually be counterproductive if they make the edges of your text very fuzzy and less defined. This one I'm actually going to have you guys look at and tell me what you think. How do you read the text on this graphic? And what is the problem? Like, what do you see being wrong with this? Okay, that's actually a good observation. The A in Arctic kind of disappears against the light background. Take a look at the text at the bottom, though, and kind of read through that and see if there's anything odd. It actually has pretty good contrast down there. Okay, so I mean, the contrast is one factor, but look at how this is worded. If you read this in blocks, say the text on the right or the left and then the text on the right, it would read, "This white fox has been given which is white predominantly spring or summer sets in this thinner and starts to become." It's kind of gibberish. It doesn't make sense. It's actually intended to be read from left to right all the way across the image, but this division kind of creates an intuitive break. We would expect this to be two separate pieces of text when it's not. So this is something to avoid. You want to place your text how you would how your reader would expect to read it, and this is association. It's keeping text that's associated with each other close together. A more effective way to have presented this message would be to have a complete part of the message on the left, and then a follow-up on the right, or just have it run in lines across the page, maybe with a text box, like a black box behind it to make it readable. So it should read, "This white fox has been given the name due to its coat, which is white predominantly in the winter season." So at least with English and a lot of Western languages, we read left to right, top to bottom, and arranging the text in that way will be conducive to how we're used to reading. This is another example. This is actually from We Love Ad website. Not quite as extreme, but somewhat, because they put that line down the middle that gives a mental barrier. It kind of divides that page, both the image as well as the ideas, when in reality it's not arranged that way. So a more intuitive way of arranging this might have been to put "whether you see it or not" on one side, "it doesn't affect my work ethic" on the other. And this is actually one I know I've commented on in some cases on the practice activity. I love for you to know how to do some special effects with your text, how to do those drop shadows and those 3D transformations, and the warping where you make an arch text. Really good to know how to do that in Photoshop. It can be useful sometimes, but really use those sparingly, because it can make your text hard to read, and it can also just look almost cliche, like something you would make it for a sign to hang in your office birthday party or something, rather than a piece of professional media. So, remember the Superman example from earlier. That's a case where they used it for a specific purpose. So if you have a purpose like that in mind, you can go for it. But otherwise, it's good just to go with the typefaces as they are. Picking a style that gives us a particular impression, as well as a color that helps to enhance that impression, rather than going for all these really distorted and transformed effects. All right, so that's just some quick things to keep in mind. I think the contrast is probably the one that I see the most often, as well as the associations. That associations idea can be really subtle. Sometimes I'll see text arranged so that the text that's meant to be read first is very low on the page, whereas the second portion might be higher. And just that little difference can create a kind of a mental disconnect. You're not really sure how that's supposed to be read. So make it easy on your readers. Place your text the way they would expect it to be placed, and read the way they would expect it to be read. Again, unless you have a very specific reason for doing it differently. Maybe you want to take advantage of that mental disconnect and make it a little quirky or out of the ordinary, but only if you have a good reason for that. So moving on to visual hierarchy. This is shifting gears a little bit. It's a separate topic, but it's related in a way. It really connects with all the topics we've covered so far in class. A hierarchy, in case you haven't encountered that word before, is an order or an order of importance, or a ranking. So the one that we're often familiar with is in medieval society. They had the peasants as the lowest rank, and then the knights and the nobles, the dukes and duchesses and barons and so forth. And then at the top is the king and queen, the royalty, right? So it's an order of importance in society. We're talking about visual hierarchy, so it's an order of importance from a visual standpoint. That is, what stands out the most, so what commands the most attention visually, and then going down in order of importance to where you have subdominant elements, things that are important but not the most important things that you have to notice. And then you get down to just the details. So we saw this example last week when talking about color, I believe. But looking at this poster design, what would you say was the top of the visual hierarchy, the most dominant element in the design, and why? The easy way to determine this is just to consider what catches your eye first. That's usually the most dominant feature. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the cup is probably, easily the most dominant element because of the color. They made use of those complementary colors, right? The orange and blue. That orange on a field of blue really stands out. Even unconsciously, our eye is pulled to that location. We notice the difference. So that's sort of the top rank of the hierarchy. Then what would be second to that? Where would you go after that? What do you notice next? In all likelihood, it's going to be that large title that's just below the cup. Because of its large font size, it has less contrast. It doesn't stand out as sharply, but it is very large and very centrally placed. So, as far as what your eye will pick up, it will be from there moving down to that title. And it's going down the line. So then you get into the smaller details. And there's actually multiple layers of visual hierarchy. In this case, you have the cup down to the title, the more important details, the name of the musician and the location. And then you have all these fine print details that would keep going down farther and farther. And this is something that's very deliberate for a designer to do. I want to see you making these kind of very deliberate choices. What do you want to emphasize, and how are you going to put emphasis on this? There's different strategies that you can use for creating hierarchy. Color contrast is a really powerful one, as you saw here. Make use of those complementary versus analogous colors to make things stand out. Our eyes are naturally geared towards noticing difference and a break from the pattern. And so breaking from a given pattern is the way to make something stand out. That can be a change in color. It can be a change in the texture, which is somewhat the case here, but it's not the main idea. And that can just be, something smooth on a rough background, or vice versa. Shape and size are a factor. Something that's very large will command more attention than something that's very small, typically. Position and orientation. If you think about pattern in the traditional sense, things that's like a repeated shape. If you suddenly change that shape, then that one element will stand out. So putting that into effect in a design, this one's pretty straightforward. They use both size and color to make that name, Allie Smith, really stand out. And then going down the line in terms of detail. The image in this case is almost secondary. It's kind of put off to the side and de-emphasized versus that really striking name that's in the title. A lot of times you'll see really emotionally charged words given greater emphasis because that will catch a potential reader's eye or an audience member's eye and create more interest. That word fallacy is very accusatory. It's pointing the finger at, putting the blame on this particular issue. And that's something you really see often in advertising, in political campaigns, in headlines. Usually if it's a headline that's putting emphasis on a particularly emotionally charged word, that could be a sign of a very biased article because they are putting a value judgment as opposed to simply reporting. So something to be wary of. And sometimes the visual hierarchy can be relatively flat, meaning things are mostly the same weight. There's not a lot of emphasis put on any particular thing. In this case, you might say that the emphasis is put on the girl because she has the only warm colors against this mostly green and gray backdrop. So, but it's very subtle. It's not like that orange cup on a blue background, and all the text is the same size and the same typeface. So they're not putting a lot of emphasis on this author's name like you would see with a well-known author like maybe Elizabeth Gilbert or somebody who is really popular at the time. And this one is probably a very literally flat visual hierarchy. There's nothing given extra emphasis other than perhaps the crack in the door, but even that is a very neutral look. So comparing that to something like wrong direction, this one right here. Where would you say the most emphasis is placed in this particular book cover? And what are the factors that influence that? This is one that makes interesting use of color. This is an example that I actually took from this week's exploration activity. And there's a kind of a range of colors present, but the level of contrast changes as we go up the page, with that really heavy orange-red around the title of the novel. So, against the blue background, really stands out. And then we have the heavy typeface font size as well. So that's been deliberately emphasized versus these less contrasting elements. So in this case, that title is deemed to be more important than the author's name. Maybe this is a new author that isn't really recognized yet, and they don't want to put emphasis there. And so this is, it all ties back to the lessons we've gone through before. The use of complementary colors, as well as size to add emphasis. And I wish I had a screenshot from, there's the film, The Life of Pi, if you've ever seen that one. So much of that movie takes place on an orange life raft in the middle of the blue ocean. And it's almost the same color contrast as what you see here, and almost the same setting, in fact. And that's actually done deliberately to keep your focus on that point, that object within the frame. So this is a principle that's used within filmmaking as well as book cover design and any other type of media. And as it happens, the orange color of the life raft is actually something that's deliberately done in real life, because that if there's rescuers out looking, they will notice that against the blue of the ocean. Again, just really deliberate use of color here to add emphasis. The title is very large and would be the most dominant element, but with that red, that splash of red, it just easily captures your eye and pulls it to that spot. You can also think about the use of lines. Here they have these concentric circles and shapes that pull us inward towards the fly or towards the shape of the face. Even using the lines in a road that travel off into the distance, they come together, you can use those leading lines to direct attention to a specific object or a location and give it extra emphasis in that way. And just to give another example of how this is really a very media neutral idea, web design makes really heavy use of visual hierarchy to direct your notice to specific areas. You can see here, this is kind of an accented achromatic. There's not a lot of color, but the parts that are in color are very key features in the design. The register now button with the exclamation points and the finger pointing is given extra emphasis with the red on gray, and then the main content area is similarly emphasized. So, and even the title with design being the focus. So regardless of what medium you're working with, whether it's digital video or web design or graphic design, you can leverage these principles to create what I refer to as sort of a guided tour for your viewers. You don't want to leave that to chance. You don't want them to. You really don't want to leave it up to them to take in your media the way they might just happen to in a given moment. You want to give them some direction, and the way to give them direction is to add emphasis to specific points. it really helps to create that visual story. It takes them, leads the eye from one point to another. And as we go into the week 3 Photoshop practice, I would like for you to really keep these in mind. It's not necessarily one of the requirements of the assignment. All I really want you to do with the practice is to learn how to manipulate color in Photoshop. But as you're doing those exercises, think about what effect those color changes are having. If you are making something less contrasting, say changing something from a warm color to a cool color that blends in with the background, you're de-emphasizing that. And that's going to cause a shift in the focal point of the entire photo. And the opposite can be true as well. If you make something more highly contrasting, you're shifting it to that object. And it can also change the mood as well. And actually, I was thinking of last week's Photoshop with the color change. This week, you're going to be doing compositing. And in the same way, you're going to be choosing where to place a particular object. In this case, it's going to be a duck, a traveling duck. If you have looked at that assignment, you're going to be placing ducks within different locations around the world. And you can choose where to place that bird and also the size that you make it within the frame. But since you already have those color principles under your belt, you can leverage those as well. No reason to stop practicing those at this point. Ducks will travel more than us humans, and more easily too. They come and go as they please. But try to make that one a more fun activity, so you can definitely have some fun with it. The same idea is true as we go into next week's final project. I really want to see some consideration for visual hierarchy. It's probably the one thing I see neglected most often, and things are kind of put together, but there isn't a lot of thought put into what you really want to emphasize. So vary the size of your text, vary the color of your text and your image elements, and make that a really well-planned experience for your viewer. All right, any last thoughts or questions before we conclude? Okay, well, that was what I had prepared for this evening. I appreciate you all joining me. This will be the last of the new content that's introduced. Next week, we will be reviewing and also talking about the final project some more. But start looking at how these factors all work together, how color, imagery, storytelling, and visual style work together to create a very specific experience, and start putting that into practice in your Photoshop work and in your final mood board assignment. But if there aren't any questions, I would be happy to let you go for tonight and get on with your evening.